Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining our first episode of our monthly webinar Wednesday series. Today's focus will be on unlocking the power of ServiceNow, reporting in 7 stages. Before we get started, I've just got some brief housekeeping. Firstly, this session is being recorded and will be available on demand afterwards. Secondly, we will be hosting a live Q&A with Mike at the end of the webinar. So you may submit questions at the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer these towards the live Q&A session. And finally, if you have any Zoom technical issues, please send me a message directly in the chat box. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to our speaker, Mike Turner.
Great, thank you, Samra. And good morning, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike Turner. I'm a principal consultant here at Unifii. We are an elite ServiceNow partner within the UK and Ireland. Now, I've been working with reporting for the past 20 years or so at companies like Computer Center, VMware, and Capgemini, trying to build standardized solutions wherever we can to help them and their customers. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been working at Unifii trying to build out the analytics practice, working with our customers to get the most out of ServiceNow, but also working directly with ServiceNow product management teams to give feedback in terms of the experience that we're seeing, our customers are seeing of ServiceNow. And at the moment, we're talking directly with ServiceNow around some of the new features that are coming out, even in Utah and Washington and Vancouver. So reporting can often feel like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, right? With ServiceNow, we've got performance analytics on one side, we've got standard reporting, and now we're going to start talking a little bit more around some of the new features with Next Experience. So, trying to get the right pieces of the puzzle together can often be a little bit of a challenge. So, as someone said, as part of our Unlocking the Power of ServiceNow reporting series, this session is going to focus on the core stages of a reporting project. Now, that might be a small project, it could be a large. It may be reporting focused, but it could also be a deployment of an application or even ServiceNow within your organization for the first time, and reporting is just one component of this. I'm not going to focus too much around the framework itself and the process. This is more around the key areas that you need to be aware of and things that you need to think about at each of those different stages. And equally, you can try and apply this back into your business. If it's your BAE process and you're just taking service requests for reports, a lot of this will also still be applicable to you. We'll spend about 20 minutes or so going through those stages. I will then move into a bit of a demo around Platform Analytics Workspace. So this is brand new in Tokyo. Many of you may not have seen it or may have seen it and just not completely sure where it aligns in terms of the reporting landscape. So we're going to spend about 10, 15 minutes or so looking at a bit of a demo around that, just to make sure you're familiar with what's new and where ServiceNow are taking the world of reporting. And we'll finish up with a bit of a Q&A towards the end. So before we jump into the detail, let me ask a couple of questions. So the first question that hopefully will launch on your screen in a second is, how many of you in the last 12 months have actually worked on a project that required reporting? Let's pause there for 10 seconds or so. Okay, well, good number of responses there. I'm just going to end the poll at this point and I'll share the results. So it looks like about 90% of you have worked and focused on reporting. 11% of you, I'm assuming, either haven't seen reporting within ServiceNow, or maybe not, certainly within the last 12 months. So one more question before we jump into the detail. How many of you have worked on a project, maybe a deployment of ServiceNow itself, where reporting was only considered right at the end of the project, or even after the project itself finished? Okay, I'm going to stop the poll now. That's very interesting. So there were still a few responses coming through there, but literally 50-50 there. So half of you essentially found that reporting didn't get considered within a project, and that's often what I see as well. Reporting is something that becomes an afterthought, and it's really important that we get better at doing that, and we'll talk a bit around some of the reasons why that's so important as we go through the session. but thank you for that. So I'm just going to close that down. So let's move into the different stages that we want to talk about today. Stage one is a fairly simple one. It's defining your high level scope. Be really clear on what it is you're trying to deliver within your project. How big is that piece of puzzle that you want to build? Look at your scope. Is it contractual reports or operational? Are we trying to build reports, or are we also trying to build dashboards as well? Do we need to build KPIs and metrics? And what applications are we focused on reporting from? So perhaps it's ITSM, but is it all of ITSM, or is it just incident management? It could be SPM, CSM, ITOM, for example. Look at your project timeline and your budget. Think about where reporting fits into that. That might be quite easy if it's a standalone reporting project, but if it's part of a broader project, where will reporting fit into that? Where do your requirements fit? At what point will you have data, for example? At what point will you be building out your reports and your KPIs? But make sure you're setting clear expectations of your scope. And what we're trying to avoid here is, at the end of this, exceeding time and budget, right? We want to stop having projects that just never stop. And also it's important that when we get to the requirement stage that we avoid scope creep. If we can sit down with our stakeholders and give them a clearly defined scope, then there's no level of ambiguity at that particular point. So stage two is a nice quick health check, reviewing your license and internal skill set. So performance analytics has become a really core part of the landscape of reporting in ServiceNow. It's really good to understand whether you've got licensing to support that. And if you've got any kind of requirements, so for example, a percentage calculation, it's likely that you'd need performance analytics for that. And if you're sitting there right now wondering whether your organization does have performance analytics support or not, feel free to reach out to us after this call and we can potentially help you get the answer around that. But also look at your skill sets. So not only may you need a report in SME, but as we go in and look at some of the requirements, we might need extra support from a business analyst or a process application SME to help get the right level of information out of our stakeholders. Your reporting SME may only be familiar with some of the reporting facilities within the tool. They may not be an expert in performance analytics, especially if you haven't utilized it yet. So you may need to look at getting a specialist or training and upskilling your reporting team. They're also aware of how to build within PA. And as we come to see, you might also need a ServiceNow developer. You might need some prerequisites that actually enable your reporting to be facilitated. But what we're trying to do here is ultimately checking your PA licensing. We want to make sure we don't end up wasting time defining requirements, spend time with your stakeholders where actually you've got no provision to build a certain proportion of those metrics. And we want to make sure you've got the right people on board. We want to make sure we get good quality requirements, the assessment is correct. And ultimately, we want to avoid stakeholder frustration at the end. So stage three is all about identifying your stakeholders and report consumers, making sure that you've got the right levels of stakeholder involved. It's really critical that that's the case. So what I've seen happen in some projects is the reporting team have worked with a stakeholder who they thought was the right person, but ultimately they delivered something that the stakeholder was happy with, but they went off and spoke to their manager and it didn't meet their requirements. So really important that we get and understand exactly who are the right stakeholders. Map each to different levels of scope. So for example, if you've got a large project, you might have certain stakeholders that are only interested in incident management, for example. Some might be interested in PPM, some might be interested in HR. So really understanding who are the stakeholders that need to be involved for each different piece of scope within your project, and define the level of responsibility. Understand who is it that we need to sit down with and actually spend time capturing those requirements with, who just needs to be informed along the way, and who needs to provide the ultimate sign-off. And what we're trying to do here is to avoid any wasted effort building reports and KPIs that ultimately become rejected or ultimately missing core pieces of that puzzle because we haven't spoken to a full breadth of the stakeholders that we should have spoken to. And stage four is probably one of the most important stages that we have here. And we should all be prepared for this to be your longest stage. So as we go into this and you speak with your stakeholders, try and set out the rules of the road. Take it back to your original scope. Make sure they're aware of what you're trying to deliver and try to avoid that that kind of scope creep that you might get in, because they're just not sure exactly what the scope actually looks like. If you're working with multiple stakeholders, work in a top-down approach. So work with your most senior stakeholders first, and that way, as you're capturing KPIs, you can try and make sure they cascade downwards throughout the chain, and everyone in the lower levels of management, for example, are actually trying to also be aligned to those particular KPIs. Make sure you do secure stakeholder time. They should have the right amount of time to go and get the information that you need out of here. And as we go through, we also want to prioritize everything. We want to document everything and make sure that we get the right level of detail. So let's take a look at an example. We've got a stakeholder and they've come to us with a list of KPIs. And that list looks fairly simple. We've got things like number of incidents, percentage of HR cases completed in SLA. And quite often what we find is that these lists just get piled across to the reporting team and get asked to go and build them. So let's take a slightly deeper look at one of those requirements. So the first one here, number of incidents, and you might think, well, this is going to be the simplest, and it is really easy to go and build, right? It's really simple metric, but when we speak to the stakeholder, we try to understand exactly what they're after, and they tell us, well, I want to know how many incidents were created. Okay, and how do you want to see that? Well, they want a single number. That's all they're interested at that point. So we start filling out our templates, and this is just a very shortened version of our templates that we use within Unifii. But we try and fill out the template, and we understand what type of visualization we want, where the data is coming from. It's important that we go through and actually define exactly what we mean by terms like opened or created. And we're consistent, and this really drives that level of standardization. So if someone says, I want number of instances created, we should really try and build everything in the same way. So in this case, our calculation definition is count the number of instances where the created field is in the reporting period. Then we ask, well, what reporting period do we need this? And this often gets missed, especially in the ServiceNow world. If you're building reports today, you'll find that each report actually needs to have the reporting periods defined in each and every one of those. So we speak to this stakeholder and they say, well, I want to have the report showing me today, yesterday, this week, last week, this month, last month, this quarter, maybe even annually as well. There's a number of variations that they expect to see. We talk about the aggregation period. In this case, we don't have any, but we capture a number of other fields. So what importance has it got? What priority do we put that onto? Does it need to be form part of a dashboard? What permissions do we need to apply to this? Does it have any associated targets? Do we need to apply any filters? And then the big question, the why. What does this particular requirement drive you? In this case, we want to make sure that the teams have the right capacity to meet the demand of tickets that are coming through. And we want to improve experience and service effectiveness. So that original requirement, we've now got one line in there of definitions. We might have to go and build 10 different reports to go and create for each of the different variations that they've asked for. But then they carry on and they say, well, I also want to know what the trend is of those tickets. So I want a time series. I want to know what that looks like over the past period. And we go through and actually understand, well, what do they mean by that? And they say, well, if I'm looking on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, I want to see my stats on a daily aggregation period. And if I'm looking on a 6-month period or last 12 months, I want to see those on a monthly basis. Again, we've got a number of different variations that are coming out of this extra line. And they go on and say, actually, I also want to know the number of open incidents that I have, and I want it in real time. I also want to be able to trend that. I want there to be some kind of snapshotting mechanism in ServiceNow where we take a snapshot at the end of each day or the end of each month, and we look at what the volume of tickets look like. We want to trend that volume to look for decreases. But I also want to know resolved as well, and I want to see that as a score. I also want to start slicing and dicing these things. I want to maybe look at the top 10 groups. I want to look at the top 10 services and service offerings, etc. So what I'm trying to get to with this is that single requirement that looks really obvious may not be that obvious to the reporting team as they get it, because we don't know exactly what they mean by that. And I think you see here, there's lots of different variations. So it's important to spend the right amount of time with the stakeholders to capture exactly what they're after for. We actually followed a similar process internally within Unifii last year. We set out to create an advanced ITSM reporting suite for our customers that don't use performance analytics. And we did exactly this. We took every single metric that we had and looked at all the different reporting periods that might be available or different aggregation periods. And we actually expanded that out by creating lots of different reports for each of those different variants. And we ended up with 13,000 reports. Now that 13,000 reports covers incident, request, problem, and change management. But you kind of get the idea of the process that we went through to go and build that. So back to that original set of requirements here. So number of incidents we took a look at, that was a fairly straightforward one. We've had to expand it. But equally, when we look at other things here, HR cases completed in SLA, well, is that response or resolution? Percentage of changes completed successfully. How do we define success? Customer service cases resolved at first contact. Well, how do we define first contact? What's the actual calculation here? What numbers am I dividing? How do I know what in the tool actually flags whether it's first contact or not? Percentage of projects completed on time. Well, is that all projects? Actually, maybe the customer wants to have external projects only. They also run internal projects and they want to exclude those. We need to spend the right amount of time there. And also, we need to challenge requirements. So this is one that we've actually seen as a real world example. Percentage of incidents caused by a change that are related to the change that caused the incident. And it's one that we need to go back to the stakeholder, talk through, and really get what they're needing out of that. But the takeaways here are, we need to spend the right amount of time properly documenting and prioritizing each requirement. I sat at a customer meeting and the customer wanted to have 25 requirements walked through in 3 hours. We ended up only getting through 6 of those in that 3-hour period. Average about 30 minutes per requirement, properly going through and document and defining. It gives you a bit of a flavor as to the kind of time that we might tend to see or expect to see in a good requirements gathering session there. So moving on to our next phase, if we've gone through and we've captured our requirements really nicely, we now want to assess and standardize as much as we can. So one of the first things that we want to do is group common reports together. So like you saw on the previous screen, we looked at incidents and we were able to group those by, I want to maybe slice it by priority and category, etc. Equally, you might find that you've spoken to 5 different stakeholders and they kind of asked you for the same thing. So in that case, you want to group them together and actually treat them as one. Try and match them against out of the box. There might be some content packs that are already available to you, and you may be able to utilize those as well. You want to ask questions like, is PA required? What kind of dashboard do I need to have? Reviewing data quality and prerequisites. Highlighting unfeasible requirements. And really important, estimate effort. So if we've gone through and actually defined all of the requirements and actually mapped those to a type of solution, we can try and estimate the effort. And that's really useful for when we get to one of the later stages. And finally, we want to go back through with the stakeholders and play back everything and sign things off. One of the key questions that I've been asked quite a few times is, within ServiceNow, how do I really distinguish between a performance analytics requirement and a report? So we put together this really simplified view. It's absolutely not categoric in terms of the usage, but it gives you a bit of a flavor. So it asks questions like, well, do I need to calculate something to measure the time between 2 points? And if I do, if things like your mean time to resolve or your time spent on assignment groups, it's likely that you're going to need some prerequisites. You may actually need to create metrics or SLA definitions. And those things might need to be built by a completely different type of skill set. You might need a ServiceNow developer rather than your reporting team to do that. Quite often we find that when we look at requirement, the fields just aren't there within ServiceNow to support that. So we need to take that back into development and actually build those fields. And again, that might be something that needs to be done by a completely separate team than the reporting. We might take a look at data quality. We might find that the fields are actually available, but the data is really poor. Maybe you want to report on the location of your tickets, but your HR data doesn't contain the location field, or actually maybe 10% of them do. So do you need to also address process and the ways of working? Do you need to change data, for example? In which case you've got another prerequisite. Each of these things is probably the 3 most important prerequisites that we tend to see within our implementations. And again, it shows the need to properly go through and assess things without just chucking the requirements straight across to the reporting team. Make sure we actually can understand where the prerequisites sit and feed those off into those teams ahead of sending them off onto the reporting team to go and build. But other questions that are really pertinent to PA versus reporting, things like, well, do you require a percentage calculation? Do we need to do advanced trending? Do they need to slice and dice the same KPI by multiple dimensions? Do we want to track against targets or generate signals based on observational data? The answer is yes to any of these. Then we're looking more to the performance analytics space, right? Obviously, performance analytics works with snapshots of data. It's not real time. We create our KPIs and we tend to run them overnight in jobs. So if we ever have a requirement that says, I want to create a percentage, but it has to be real time, that's just a conversation that you need to have back with the stakeholder to try and find out what the best fit is. It might be a case that you can create underlying numbers within reporting that can be real time, but the percentage KPIs itself, you might go and build within performance analytics. But reporting or data visualization, is still an option to go and create if the answer is no. And even if you answered yes to, I want to slice and dice by different dimensions, doesn't mean you have to use performance analytics. You can use reports, and just like how we built our ITSM reporting suite, it may be a case that you can build lots of different reports for those different areas. So as we move out of our requirement stage, we move into stage 6, so scope alignment and detailed planning. We want to take everything that we've just done, all of our requirements, all of our assessment, and compare it back to the original scope. Using the prioritization that we've carried out and the estimates can help us create different sprints, deciding on the environment that we're going to use. Do we have data at that point? What environment are we going to use there? And making sure that the ultimate plan that we have includes all of those prerequisites. If you find that the assessment has identified that actually the time needed for the project exceeds how much time you estimated or put aside, then you might need to go through into scope, but you can use the prioritization to go and do that. Just make sure you are talking back to your stakeholders around that. So do make sure that you are reviewing the assessment against the original scope. You want to make sure that the stakeholders are on board. If you are descoping things, then and make sure that they're fully happy with that. The worst thing that they're going to want to see is at the end of the project when you hand it over, there's things that have been descoped and they haven't been told around that. And the final stage, and this really is, this should really be the simplest part of it: the build, test, and deploy. If we've captured really good requirements and we've assessed everything, we know exactly what's going to be built through new fields and what's going to be built through reporting and performance analytics. It's simply a case of going passing that across and starting to build, involving the stakeholders along the way, especially if you're building dashboards. I always find that dashboards are quite a personal thing. So when we capture requirements, we tend to make them slightly looser, capturing the essence of what needs to go on there. Some of the layout and the look and feel of those dashboards tends to be something that we work directly with our stakeholders, and would recommend that you did the same if you're working on a project that involves building the dashboards. We implement permissions and we test. And this the biggest part of this is making sure you've got data, right? And there's some areas that you might find that you can't fully test. For example, year-on-year comparisons. If you're only just going live, you may not have that type of data yet. So be conscious of that, and you might need to make some decisions along the way around actually how do you test that, or even if you test it at all. Maybe it's something that you just park and you only deploy that functionality maybe a year down the line when you can actually do that. Document everything. If you've gone through your requirements gathering and carried out documentation, that you can extend that documentation for the build as well and try and reuse that. And carry out a technical handover training that you might need to carry out for maybe the service desk or support teams, and finally deploy. But the emphasis here is that if you've got everything right in all those other preceding stages, the build should be fairly straightforward, and you've got a fine timeline. You haven't got ambiguity in the reporting teams who are wondering exactly what to build and whether it's the right thing to do. And we tend to find we spend a lot of time questioning requirements that have come through because the right amount of time perhaps haven't been spent. We haven't got the right level of detail from the original stakeholders. So that's our 7 different stages. I want to move on now to a bit of a demo. Now, before I move into the demo itself, I want to give you a bit of an overview as to some of the changes that are coming up with ServiceNow and reporting, especially with the introduction of Next Experience. So when we've looked historically at reporting, the landscape looks something like this. We've got data. That data could be maybe our process tables. It might even be your SLAs and your metrics as well. And you've got the option today to go and create reports. And even your users have got the option to go and create their own reports on there. And those reports go into things called responsive dashboard. If you've got performance analytics involved, then our data moves into what's called a performance analytics indicator. They're typically configured by admins or PA admins. They do require a special skill set to go and build. And as I said, we schedule them through jobs, and we associate dimensions and breakdowns to them. We've also got build interactive filters at this stage. So if you want any kind of dashboard that you want to filter, you actually need to build those interactive filters as an admin rather than an end user. But the emphasis here is that when we've got reports in the mix and we've got PA in the mix, we've got to build our reports in a separate area called reports, and we've got to build our PA widgets completely separately. And either of those two things can go onto responsive dashboards. But it can be difficult to navigate through. And again, you might need you might find that your user can't create as much as they want to because it's not familiar with how do I configure this piece here around the PA widgets. When we look at next experience, we now see that Platform Analytics Workspace has been introduced. And we see a big change in this. And we're seeing this more around the presentation layer than the data layer at this particular point in time. But what you will notice is whilst the data layers seem very similar, we've got our regional data tables. We also got new user experience analytics, which has been recently introduced and has some compatibility with performance analytics now, just to call out there. This stuff all exists in the same way. But what's really changed is this piece. So rather than having reports and widgets, we've now got these new things for data visualization. Rather than having responsive dashboards, we've now got workspace dashboards instead. And the filtering capability is something that can be created by end users. It doesn't need to be created by admins. Analytics Hub, for example, has been replaced with KPI details, and we now introduce KPI signals on top. So rather than me staying on these slides, I'm going to jump off and give you a bit of a demo live on the screen. So hopefully you can all see my ServiceNow instance. When we look at reports previously, we've got to go and look at the menu, and we've got to find all of our reports that exist. They exist in the menu down here, and users have to go and navigate that particular area to find all the reports that are available to them, or even to go in and create their own reports in the system. Equally, if they want to look at dashboards, they've got to do the same thing. So they've got to find a menu item called dashboards, and they can go in and they can find the dashboards that they want to create, and they can even find some things that maybe have created by some of the content packs that are in the system today. If we want to add a new report on here, we've actually got to create that report already. So that report that we have, change that filter slightly. So that report needs to exist, or you need to go and create that report and then add it on. And if I want to go and add something from performance analytics, I have to go in and find the type of breakdown that I want if it doesn't already exist, and find that widget and configure it. And that widget configuration isn't the most friendly. This is an example. It's field-based. It's not the most intuitive screen to go and configure and understand from an end user perspective. How do I build that visualization that I want to put onto the dashboard? So what's changed? Well, if you look in Tokyo onwards, you'll see that there's a new workspace section, and in workspaces, you've got a new menu item called Platform Analytics Workspace. The Platform Analytics Workspace is essentially a one-stop shop for all of your reporting capability from an end user perspective. That's how ServiceNow are now positioning all of this. And what we can see here is Analytics Center. So you might also see Analytics Center in other workspaces that you can deploy, but essentially this workspace in particular is just a place that everyone can go to, and it's commonly known. In here, we have the ability to see your quick view of dashboards and quick view of visualizations that are available to you. We can also see on the last tab here, your KPIs. So one of the problems that we had previously was people weren't really adopting Analytics Hub, which is kind of the equivalent of this. But with it being in this workspace, users can actually see all the different KPIs that are available to them, and they can also go through and bookmark individual KPIs that are of interest. So as they go through, they can maybe have a concise screen here, focus on incident management here, for example. If I want to look at number of new incidents, I can click on that and jump into KPI details. The KPI details is the equivalent of what Analytics Hub was in classic UI. And all of these features are along the side in parallel to the original. So we're not replacing the reports and dashboards or Analytics Hub directly. These are additional functionality that's available, and they will run in parallel for some time here. The KPI details gives you very much similar functionality as we had in Analytics Hub. We can see trends of data across time. We can play with different periods. If I want to look at that on maybe a monthly basis, for example, I can go and do that, right? And change the period of time that I want to go and look at. You see everything launches in different tabs, which is quite a lot more friendlier than hitting the back button all of the time. But your KPIs are here. What we've also got is an area called data visualization. Now, data visualizations essentially allow you to create your equivalent of reports. So whilst reports exist in the classic UI, you can have the ability to create data visualizations in Next Experience. As part of this, what we can do is you'll see that the actual build experience is a lot easier. So we can add a new data source. And as I'm adding a new data source, you'll observe that I can actually click and pick from either the general tables or from an indicator. In this case, maybe I want to pick the instant table. And I want to say, I want this based on created on this month, perhaps. And as I do that, it's fairly straightforward to go and add this source. I'm not jumping around to lots of different screens. I'm creating a visualization on the fly. I can change the type of visualization that I might want to control. But what I can also do, which is really not a great feature, is if I want to use performance analytics, I can equally go and say, I want the number of new incidents. That is under as an indicator. So I've prepared it already, but essentially it's down number of new. There we go. So I can use an indicator instead, right? So really, from an end user perspective, it becomes simpler. We don't need to have admins that are going through and actually calculating the different, especially on the PA side of things, and actually creating those PA visualizations. They don't need to go and do that. So, and it's much more a consistent look and feel. Those visualizations can be created independently, so you can go in and create those. Users can also create visualizations. One of the really nice features around Next Experience is that you have the capability for admins to certify things. So as we're going through and looking, you can see, for example, here that I've got a number of visualizations that are certified. That essentially means that they've been created by a central reporting team, as opposed to being created by any user in the system. And that's going to be really important, because what we tend to find with a lot of organizations is that they've got thousands and thousands of reports. Any user that goes into the system and looks at the library that's available to them, they're not sure exactly which ones to use and which one's been created effectively, and as per a kind of a standard definition. So what your reporting teams can now do is go and build new visualizations that actually meet certain requirements that we know have been tested properly, and we can mark them as being certified. The visualizations are kind of your equivalent of reports, but they're also the equivalent of your widgets as well in PA. So it replaces both of those layers and replace it with a single layer there. We can also go in and create dashboards. And again, these dashboards are workspace dashboards. So they're not the same dashboards that you'll use in terms of functionality. We all used to using responsive dashboards, for example. But what you'll see here is, again, a nicer framework for building out your dashboards. So for example, I can add in a data visualization, whereas in responsive dashboards, we would have always had to go and create all of our reports first. I can actually come in here and build out my visualization on the fly as I'm going. But we can also go and add in visualizations from the library. So one here, instance resolved this month. I know that's certified. I can add that particular visualization in there. We can do some other cool things as well. So we can add in things like images, we can easily do. And those images can work either with images that are uploaded by an admin into the tool and available to you, but you can also use generic URLs. So if you've got a location that is accessible by ServiceNow that can pick up the images, you can go and replace that with a URL, and it will change that for you as well. So it might be your logo, for example, that sits on your domain. And really, really nice thing here, one of the most important things, is that there's much better control of the header. So whereas the header was previously limited, we can actually put visualizations into the header. We can also help brand these dashboards. And really important feature is that we can add filters into your header as well, and we can add multiples. So if you've worked with ServiceNow before, you'll know that this has been a big pain point for lots of our customers. One, for the fact that you couldn't apply multiple filters in the header at the same time, but secondly, because you've had to always have your filters pre-created by an admin. We can now actually create your filters on the fly. So I can actually pick from the instant table and say, I want this filter to be based on assignment group, for example. That filter is now there. It can now be used. You also see that I'm in editing mode, which is slightly different to before as well. So I can now go in and out of edit mode, and you can see that filter is there. We've got a nicer UI. And just to show you here, one I created earlier. So this is just a bit of a side-by-side comparison between performance analytics kind of visualizations and traditional database visualization. You can see here that we've added a logo in the corner up here. We can see that we've added filters. We've got multiple on here. If I want to filter everything by P3 and P2, for example, I can go and do that, and it will change the entire dashboard. We can easily go and clear that. But you'll see that the visualization look and feel the same. So these two, one down here, so new instance by priority and the one for PA, actually have the same look and feel. One's actually created based on performance analytics indicator, one's based on pure data. We can see that we've got some PA widgets over here, which will focus on your KPIs around things like your response times and resolve times. And again, everything that we have on here, we can drill down onto. But it's important to note, anything you drill down from like before, if you drill down from a report or a normal data visualization, that will take you down straight down to the data. Whereas if you're drilling down from a performance analytics indicator, it will take you back down to back that into KPI details. Now we can spend longer on this and go through in more detail, but what I really want to get across is the fact that reporting is changing within ServiceNow, and organizations need to start thinking about how do we deliver reports and where do we deliver reports. We're seeing more changes coming out in each release. We're seeing some things that aren't quite there yet. So for example, workspace widgets that we have in performance analytics aren't replicated yet. Cascading filters aren't here, but we're seeing some really cool things that are there that just aren't replicated. Long-term roadmap in the space is that next experience will eventually replace the reports and dashboards that we're used to. It'll probably take a couple of years, just like home pages were deprecated and have now moved into responsive dashboards. We're seeing that journey start from responsive dashboards and reports starting to move across, and we'll likely see more changes around the PA space as well. So I'm going to jump back into a couple of last slides before we hit the Q&A. So top takeaways from today's call are: review if you're licensed for performance analytics, or even if you're licensed and not making use of it. There's some fantastic content packs for lots of the applications that may help you just get some starting value out of them. So really review and see if you've got that licensing in place. Identify and look at any skills gap that you might have as well within your organization. We talked about the difference between the sort of reporting SMEs, PA as well, and some of the other areas. Do spend the right amount of time on requirements and assessment before jumping in and trying to do the build. Really important that we don't just pass across requirements into the reporting SMEs. Start thinking about your adoption journey for next experience and platform analytics workspace. And finally, we try to, for that 50% that we spoke to before, we really need to try and change that methodology of reporting being an afterthought. We need to start thinking about reporting being at the forefront of a project. It may be a case that reporting isn't built to the end, but those prerequisites that we create, all those new fields that might need to be there and process changes, it'd be much easier to go and capture those throughout the deployment project than having to retrofit them in at the back. And please feel free to reach out to us if we can help in any of these areas, or even if you want to talk to us a bit more around our advanced ITSM reporting suite that we have available for customers that don't have performance analytics entitlement today. We've got one final poll, I believe. I'm just going to try and find that on my screen. So hopefully on your screen at the moment, you've got a question. We would love to run another topic around another webinar around another topic here. So what topic would you be most interested in seeing at a future webinar? I think there's multiple choice available here as well. Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. Okay, great. So it looks like majority of people want to see a bit of more of a deep dive on visualizations of workspace dashboards. Fantastic. So we'd love to do another session around that. So we'll take these away and look to create a second session. One thing I would also say, my slides aren't moving on. We'd also love to have a session around an advanced use case that you may have within your organization. We'd love to spend time with you, trying to solve that with you. And if we can take that back and anonymize that back into this forum, that would be great. So if you've got a use case that you think that we could anonymize at the end of it, please feel free to come and talk to us as well. And we'd love to do that. We'll work with you and try and play that back in a future session. So that's it for me. Hopefully that was that was a good session for you guys and you could learn a lot. I'll hand over to Samara for the Q&A.
Awesome. We've got some questions in. So firstly, when a workplace dashboard is shared, do the widgets need to be individually shared, or is there a parent-child relationship?
It's a great question, and the great news here is they don't need to. So there's a really big pain point that we have today where you've actually got to go and create all your reports and you've got to share each and every report, and then you add them onto a dashboard, then you share your dashboard, and if you've forgotten to share one report, your dashboard doesn't completely work. So when you share your dashboard, if they've got a number of visualizations on there, the fantastic news there is actually your visualizations will also be available to you. So you can create visualizations as part of the dashboard. You can create them independently as well. Of course, if you are creating visualizations independently, you will need to share those, but though you can create dashboards with all of your visualizations on the fly and just share the dashboard.
Amazing. Thanks for that. There's also a question, is platform analytics workspace available in the next experience with Tokyo without the PA license?
Yes, it is. So don't get confused. It isn't something that requires performance analytics. You'll be able to create your visualizations based on your data. Any out-of-the-box indicators that might be available to you will also be there. It just means without performance analytics, you can't go and create your own new KPIs.
Amazing. Okay. We've got a few more questions here as well. How do you deal with conflicting stakeholder requirements?
Yeah, so we always find this, right? So we've worked with customers, and especially the larger groups where you've got multiple stakeholders giving you requirements, you may not always get consensus as to what is the right way to go. We typically try to work with the stakeholders to get an agreement. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we do really have to create separate versions of those, but as a complete last resort. So we always try and work towards getting a standardization where we've got consensus, and only where we can't, we deviate slightly. But it's important to document those deviations to kind of agree what is the standard, and if maybe it's a different definition for different parts of the business, making sure that we call those out in the KPI names of the reports.
Yeah, great to hear. Also, if we can use both PA and reporting for the same requirement, would you always use report by default?
No. So if we can use PA, we try to use PA as much as we can, because we can create the extra value of being able to drill down into your results. We can slice and dice those. There's obviously going to be more overhead in creating more reports and actually having that volume to maintain and work with. So we'd always try and recommend performance analytics, but there's definitely reasons why you'd want to create some things in reporting. For example, if you want to slice and dice by loads and loads of different combinations, performance analytics only supports 2 combinations right now. So sometimes we might have to work with reports to solve some of that stuff.
Cool. Okay, and do you need to have a PA license to use the platform analytics workspace?
No, I think it's the same question that was asked earlier, but yeah, there's no need to have a PA license.
Awesome. Okay, and then a final one. And if there are any other questions, please do submit them. Does the platform analytics workspace come with any OOTB visualizations and dashboard?
So out of the box, at this point in time, no. There's nothing. If you launch the workspace yourself, you'll find that it's completely blank slate. Now, ServiceNow are releasing this as a product at the moment, and the teams that are responsible for different applications of ServiceNow are playing catch up behind the scenes. So they're essentially being asked to look at their content packs, how they utilize all of the next experience features. We will see more coming in this space, and I predict that we will see some out of the box visualizations. But at this moment in time, certainly in Tokyo, we won't see that.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, sorry, there is one more question as well. Is the workspace layout only available in the new UI, as we chose not to go with the new UI?
Yes, it is. So it's only available as part of the next experience UI. You wouldn't have that. When we talk about it, we distinguish between classic UI and next experience. But yeah, it's only available in new.
Okay, perfect. If you want to go to your final slide, Mike, feel free to, and then we can close off the event.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, so if you want to keep an eye out for follow-up email, which will contain a recording link of the webinar today, a survey, a free ebook, and the opportunity to book a free strategy session, please keep an eye out for that email. We'll also be announcing and opening registrations for episode 2 very soon of the webinar Wednesdays, which is scheduled for next month. Once again, thank you for joining today's webinar. We hope you found it insightful, and we're sure that you did, with Mike as our speaker, and we look forward to hosting you again. I'll hand it over to you, Mike, if you have any final words. But thank you so much.
No, but yeah, thank you, Samara, and thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to the next session.
Great, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.